Hello and welcome to another episode of Trash to Track. First off, in this episode we're going to be looking at this Lima Crab locomotive that's been sent to me by a chap called Peter, and what becomes immediately apparent is this large bulge in the tender side, which to me indicates that the metal weights are expanding due to the dreaded Mazak rot. Before we disassemble this crab, I'm going to give it the old usual battery test on the length of a test track to see if the loco is indeed a runner. So lining it up on the track there, the battery test proves that this crab is a runner. However, that bulging metal weight in the tender there, although it's not a very good runner, to be honest, it does need a service, but that bulging metal tender weight poses an immediate problem and indeed a risk to this loco. So I'm going to start by inverting it in my loco cradle, and we'll get this loco stripped down. First of all, I unscrew this screw here in the tender off the drawbar to separate the loco and tender, which are semi-permanently coupled when running, and just pop that wire off the screw there, and then I gently force the tender body off. Now, one of the weights is wedged inside the body shell there, and this one, which you can see is suffering severely from Mazak rot, is actually stuck in the chassis. This one here took some getting out, but we've got it out now. And the tender body shell is quite badly warped. So it looks like we've caught this just in time before the tender body shell was split. Now, these tender weights are suffering from some sort of metal fatigue or Mazak rot, and they are crumbly, and as you can see they're out of shape and they're cracking up. This is the same sort of damage that happened to the Hornby Class 31s. Now, testing the motor outside of the chassis there with a battery on the terminals proves that it's a good runner. So it just needs a service, and the front wheels need sorting out as well. As you can see there, the tender wheels are actually Lima steam engine wheels from a tank engine, as they've got holes for the crank pins. Now, it made me worried, and I dug my crab out of the storage. This crab loco I've got was actually one of the original locos I bought when I first started Trash to Track. But the tender body shell on mine, the tender clips are broken, but my weight, although one is missing, my weight seems to be in good order. So I'm not overly worried about it at this point. But all the clips are broken off mine. So now I'm thinking that this is going to be a 2-loco rebuild. But then Mark, whose Duchess we featured in a episode before, sent me some more engines to repair. And in amongst them was another crab. So I thought, well, I'll do all 3 locos in one rebuild. Although initially I was only going to do the red one, which belonged to Peter. But this crab, the front wheels are locked up. So they all need some sort of service. So I thought I'd kill 3 birds with one stone and do them all for one video. So we've got my crab in the background, Peter's maroon crab, and Mark's British Railways one, which is also suffering from a tender bulge. Now, the footage I have of servicing Peter's motor I actually lost. So in this time-lapsed footage of me servicing this motor, you can see there how I stripped it down, brushed all the metal fragments out of it, cleaned the armature faceplate there with cotton buds and meths, polished it up and then cleaned the gaps and gave the motor a good clean. It's very similar to a Ringfield motor. The brushes were cleaned, as were the springs. The cogs were all oiled, the bearings were oiled, and everything was reassembled and then tested. Now we're back here now, so that footage was out of sequence, but this is the footage I've gained from Peter's crab. So, reassembling the model here, you can see I'm putting some silicone grease on the gear spindles, as this loco had very little lubrication in it at all. So I make sure that all the spindles are very well lubricated. And then I put the gears back onto their relevant pinions, the smaller of the gears going on the bottom, and the twin-cogged gear engaging with the motor there. These are then held in place with a metal clip, and as I said, it's quite similar to Ringfield. I'd imagine this is Lima's version of a Ringfield motor. Once that's all done and the cogs are in place, I just drop a tiny bit of oil on top of the silicone just to dilute it a little bit and give it plenty of lubrication. And then I'm going to give it a quick test with the old fingers there to make sure everything is lined up and engaged. And I need just to put a little bit of oil under there. And then once that's done, I turn it around and replace the magnet and the commutator and armature. So yeah, servicing these motors from Lima is relatively straightforward. And now you can see that the motor is upended in my helping hands with the connectors from a power lead while I polish the wheels with a fiberglass pencil, followed by a cotton bud and methylated spirits. I also do the wheel backs on this side, as the pickups are rub on the wheel back, so they need to be crystal clean as well. Once that's done, I also add a little bit of lubrication on the axles there as they're spinning around, just to spread it through the axle bearings. So yeah, this model, this Trash to Track, sorry, is going to feature 3 locos. One is from Peter over at Delft Junction. One is from Mark over in Ireland, and then there's my own one. And like I said, my own one, weathered, I bought as a non-runner for the original batch of Trash to Track. It came in the same ones that I bought the Dean goods in. Here I'm just adjusting the wheel back-to-backs on the tender, as one of the wheels was loose on its axle. So after testing, I just adjust it slightly so that it's all properly engaged. And then I clean the non-driving flangeless dummy wheels that sit under the motor there to make the 3-axle tender. It is interesting that Lima used steam tank engine wheels on their tender drive as their tender drive wheels on this model. Once that's done, the motor simply clips back into the chassis plate there and is reattached with 2 flat-headed screws. This method is used on all of the Crabs as they are all put together in the same way. Once the motor's in place, we will just tighten the screws up there. And then once it's all back in place, I'm just going to give it a test with the power leads just to make sure everything's still working, and that the connection point where the drawbar sits, which connects power, is connecting power through and doesn't need any extra cleaning. Now I'm going to give the tender body shell a quick dust over, as it was quite dusty, and to try and remedy this bulge in the tender side, I'm going to put it in some clamps and then leave it for a few days to hopefully bend the plastic back into shape. Now, this was another troublesome part of the rebuild. Just giving this body shell on the loco drive here a bit of a dusting. I was going to remove the chassis to lubricate and clean the wheels, and also check the metal weight that's inside the boiler to make sure that had no expansion. But when I put this part in my loco cradle, I found another problem with these Lima locos. And that screw there that you can see, this was seized in the plastic. I believe this screw had expanded and it took an absolute age to get it out. Using a screwdriver and some force, all that did was break the screw head. The screw was breaking up with the screwdriver. And I tried all manner of screwdrivers to try and release this screw, but to no avail. In the end, and this footage here is sped up, this took me over an hour to do this. But in the end, what I had to do is I had to get my serrated long-nosed pliers that I reviewed in a previous Aldi and Lidl tool video, and I grabbed it and turned it with those. Now, checking the other 2 locos in this rebuild, somebody had already replaced the screw on my Crab, and the one on Mark's turned as a screw should. So for some reason, the metal on this one, the maroon Crab here, on Peter's, had expanded, and it took forever to get out. And I was conscious I didn't want to break the body shell. So here we are, turning it quarter by quarter using some serrated pliers there. And this was the only way I could get it out. So once this is out, I'm going to have to look through my spare screws and find another one to replace this. Once the screw comes out, eventually, you can see that some of the thread has worn off. And when you touch the head of the screw, it was flaking away. This had expanded as well. But now that's out, we can unclip the chassis from the body shell. There's an extra detailing part there that clips on, so we'll try not to lose that. And then we can take the wheel keeper plate off. Now this is clipped on, and I found the easiest way to do it was gently sliding a flat-bladed screwdriver underneath it, and then just disengaging all the clips on the side which eventually worked and revealed another metal weight in the bottom there. And obviously the wheels sit in plastic bearings, so there's no proper bearings on this model. And the front pony just unclips as well. So the wheels seem to be turning okay, but they were grinding a little bit. So now we've got it all apart, I'm going to clean the pickups on the front of the loco with some methylated spirits and a cotton bud as usual. And I also clean the wheels and the wheel backs. Now that that pickup's in there, the wheels are turning okay, but one of the axles is rubbing on the metal weight there, which I hadn't noticed at this point. So I lubricated the axles up slightly and then test the running, and it was a slight amount of grinding there, but it's out of sequence. Again, I did take this apart again and file the weight down, which you'll see shortly, as there was quite a bit of dust on the chassis plate there, and the dust had actually came off the weight inside the loco. I ended up doing this to all three crabs in the end. When I disassembled them, I filed all the weights in the front down, as they hadn't seemed to expand very much, but they had let off a lot of dust. So it's something to keep an eye on in the future. Now that's been done, that chassis seems to be running a lot nicer. Now I'm just going to clean off the pony wheels here, because there was a lot of dried up carbon. And then I'll give all the wheels a good polish up with the fiberglass brush. And then the chassis, after doing the work to the weight and lubricating it up a bit better, now is lovely and free running. So yeah, some of the shots in this Trash to Track are out of sequence from doing 3 locos altogether. So here I am, I'm just putting the body shell back on the chassis. There's a front lug that connects into a hole in the chassis, and then the body shell just clips down. And then getting my tub of spare screws, and I'm going to go through and see if we can find one now that will fit the threaded hole already. That one was too narrow, which was a shame, as it was a cross-headed screw, which I prefer to use. You get more purchase on it. And then I found this flat-headed screw, which was too wide. And then I tried all manner of screws until eventually I found what I think was an old Lima one, off a loco that's long since gone. I don't know what loco it came from. But testing this in the chassis, it seemed to be an exact match. So this was screwed in place of the one that had expanded. I know this screw is going to be good because it's been in my spares box for years, so I've got no issues with that. So once that's done, I'm going to use a small amount of super glue here on the tender, just to super glue the lugs back on, as these had been snapped off due to the body shell being pushed outwards by that wayward weight that was in there. And once these are glued on, I set that aside to dry, and then get another drawer out my spares bin and see if we've got some weights that'll fit. Unfortunately, going through them, although I did have weights that fit the gap, they were all too tall and not fit for purpose really. So all the weights I've got in here, this just proves I never throw anything away. I keep it all, and doing Trash to Track, it has actually come in handy, having various loads of spares. But I couldn't find a weight that fit. And in the left hand side there you can see the tender body shell in the clamp. But I did have this lead flashing roll, so what I'm going to do is going to cut strips off this, and they were glued in place in lieu of the body weight, and now it's weighing roughly what it did. I'm going to unclamp that now. That's been in that clamp about a day or so, and you can see that the body shell is slowly going back to how it should. So now the weights are on, I'm going to reattach the tender body shell using the clips, but I also put a small amount of satin varnish on them just to hold the tender body top on, as it was slightly loose through the warping of the weights expanding. And there you can see it's just held in place with a couple of elastic bands. So while the satin varnish was drying, I upend the loco again into the loco cradle, line up the tender drawbar, and then get this thin piece of springy wire that fits in that tiny protrusion on the drawbar there, and this is to aid power collection from the front of the loco to the tender. And need one of those pliers there just to slide it through the gap. And then there's a ring on one end where the screw sits through, and then it was reattached to its tender, ready for testing. Now this was relatively simple service. It was just the weights that let this one down. And I was surprised because all three had elements of this metal fatigue. So now I'm just testing all the wheels with the power controller leads there, just to make sure that everything's connected up and running all right, which it appears to be. There is no pickup from the traction tired side of the tender, but everything else, all the pickups seem to be okay. One last job on Peter's maroon crab is just a tiny amount of oil on the crank pins and all the connecting rods, just to keep them lubricated for a good few years use yet. And then that was set aside to let the varnish dry, and now I'm going to turn my attention to Mark's British Railways crab, because this is also showing signs of that metal fatigue, as you can see. Releasing the tender and that from Mark's is the same, but when I release the tender body, you can see the motor is full of dust. That is horrendous. And these weights again are exactly the same as Peter's crab. They have corroded, they've deformed themselves, and if we hadn't got to these soon, these would have been write-offs. I mean, that weight is firmly stuck, and the dust coming off these was horrendous. I mean, you can see it all there on the top of that motor and all on the cogs. So this required a thorough stripping down, and every single part of this motor was cleaned with first contact cleaner. Once that had dried, I gave it a good scrubbing in some hot soapy water, and then it was all just given a good scrub. I mean, look at it. It is absolutely caked in that dust from that metal. There's something to be aware of. If you've got a Lima Crab in your collection, I would drag it out of storage pretty quick and have a look at it. And for some reason, this is the time-lapse footage that we saw earlier again. I don't quite know why I put this in the video twice, but again, it's to service the motor. It's to service the motor on Mark's crab, because it was horrendous. So yeah, if you've got a Lima Crab, please do get it out and check it, because this metal expansion will ruin it. Now, if you remember, the wheels on Mark's crab, the driving wheels, wouldn't turn. And this is the example of the driving weight here that's expanded. And it had actually pushed the chassis, outwards to prevent the wheels turning. There's two lugs on the back there, and they have expanded so much that it pushed the chassis out of alignment. And there's all dust in here as well, so this is going to require a thorough cleaning as well. So using my trusty old flat file, this is how I dealt with the loco weight, just filing down all sides, and then once it had been filed for a few minutes each side, the wheels are turning a lot more freely. So Mark's crab was reassembled, as we've just seen, and that was set aside, and you can see now the wheels are turning lovely. Now, my own crab was serviced exactly the same way. However, with mine, I'm going to fit a digital decoder to it. So I've connected the red and black wires to the track pickup there, the orange and grey ones to the motor terminals, and then it was reassembled in the same way as the other two. Let's remind ourselves of what we started with at this mammoth loco rebuild. This was Peter's crab in LMS maroon. The tender sides were bulging out. It was a intermittent runner, and it was in dire need of a service, especially with those weights expanding themselves in the tender there. So we stripped it down and gave it a thorough overhaul, and this is what she looks like now. The tender bulge has gone. She's a lot more free running. She's been fully serviced and runs a treat, ready to go back for many years service on Pete's Delft Junction Railway. So they only did the turntable shot here for Pete's loco, as that was the main focus of this trash to track. I didn't plan on overhauling 3 locos in one video, but I'm going to leave you now with some shots of all 3 crabs running round. Peter's and Mark's crab will be running on my son's DC layout, as they are DC only. And then at the end, you'll see my own crab running around my layout on the seawall section, having been digitally fitted. I know a lot of people don't like Lima locos, but looking at these 3 locos, there's nothing to be worried about. Yes, the detail level might not be the same as Bachmann's version, but they're superb runners when they're properly maintained, and they look the part. They have that shrugged shoulder look at the front of the locos, just as the real ones did. And here we see Mark's and Peter's crabs double heading, This will never happen again, as Mark's crab is soon be going back to Ireland and Pete's crab will be going back to East Anglia. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured in a future episode of Trash to Track, email me on the email address on screen, dansmodelrailways@gmail.com, and we'll have a look at it getting sent over and repaired or serviced or whatever you require. Just contact me on email and we can have a look. I'll leave you now with some shots of the crabs, as I said, running around. Thanks again for watching Trash to Track. I appreciate your support with it, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.